Welcome to my podcast, and today I'm sitting in a large room behind the castle in the castle courtyard, and my guest today is an old friend of mine who obviously looks very young, Ranald Macdonald, and actually we went to university together, so that was, I can't tell you how many years ago. We were both at St Andrews University, which was the most amazing few years, certainly of my life, enormous fun. And after that, Ranald went to London and he set up a restaurant business called Boisdales. And when I returned to London, I ended up training as a chartered accountant and miraculously passing all my exams in the end. Welcome, Ranald. Thank you so much for joining me. And I know that I loved St Andrews University, but I lived in London. To me, it was an entire contrast. But what were your years like at university in St Andrews?
I loved St Andrews, and we had a lot of fun together. And
that sounds bad.
But it's true. But I think I slightly regret not going to a bigger city university and immersing myself more in the real world, because it was quite a cocooned world at St Andrews. It was small and intimate and very friendly and very easy. It didn't involve many challenges apart from the work itself.
Well, I was the opposite, because I went to school in London. So for me, it was a joy to go to university, which I deliberately chose, somewhere entirely different, with a backdrop of Scotland to explore in holidays and to drive round. I find the scenery of Scotland completely magical, and I'm forever grateful for the time I managed to spend up there.
Well, I also applied to Edinburgh and Aberdeen, where I both also got places. Edinburgh, so I have a son who's just finished at Edinburgh. Edinburgh looked like a lot of fun. We obviously went to Edinburgh a few times, didn't we? And there were lots of parties, and it's obviously a little bit more urban. And I have another son who went to Glasgow, who loved Glasgow. But whenever you meet a student today, or a young person who's just been through the university process, they tend to be totally and utterly infatuated and in love with the city within which they were at university. Whether it's Leeds, Glasgow, Edinburgh, or Newcastle, they love the cities that they lived within. And St Andrews was incredibly beautiful, but it was a small, quaint place. And I think of it as the Mayfair of Scotland. I went back there the other day. It's so rich. It's unbelievable. Really smart shops and restaurants and really smart cafes and little cocktail bars. It's just very smart.
Well, funny enough, my number 6 sister ended up going to St Andrews, and she studied French, and she also loved it. But then, sadly, my mother had died as well as my father, so we all went up to her graduation, and I couldn't believe how it had changed with the smarter shops, whereas we had one supermarket, Willie Lowe's, one fish and chip shop, one chemist. But I loved the small quaintness of it, and I'm glad I was there with that time. But then I think for me it was the contrast against London. And then, of course, I then spent my next years working in London with PwC as an auditor and trying to pass my exams. So I had that reversal back into London again. And you then, of course, did with starting Boisdales Restaurants, which was an amazing endeavour, Ranald.
I started my wine business first after I was thrown out of St Andrews for the third time.
I wasn't necessarily going to share that, but yes.
But I did manage to get back in. And on my third time, I managed to get back in, having had a psychiatric assessment. And I got a medical certificate saying that I was abnormally lazy. And that was how I managed to get back in. But I did have one of my brightest ideas when I was back in London trying to work out what I was going to do for the remaining year before retaking my exams.
For the seventh time!
And
Is it the seventh time?
I can't remember. But I had a good idea, because I thought, well, I'll sell wine because everyone buys wine. Everyone I know drinks wine, so all I've got to do is buy it from source. And I'd noted at St Andrews that only had 4 wine shops, that an identical bottle of wine of the same vintage would sell for maybe about a 50 pence price difference between the 4 shops. So I thought, if I can just get the wine at the right price and make 50p a bottle, £6 a case, and sell 100 cases, £600 a week, I can make a living. So I went to, pre the internet, the source for information about the world was a big, thick, yellow-covered tome called the Yellow Pages.
Yes.
And I pulled it open, went under Wine Merchant, And what I noticed instantaneously was that not one wine merchant in central London had an advertisement in Yellow Pages. They're all too smart. Some had emboldened entries, but none had an advertisement. So I stuck an ad in. I was still a student, and I took a half-page ad in Yellow Pages, which was then £800. So in today's money, that's a lot of money. That's like about 3 or 4 grand. Luckily, it was on 3 months' credit. I stuck in a big ad, which came out in November 2005, and within 3 months, I turned over £100,000 worth of business.
Goodness me.
Just giving the telephone number of my mother's dining room and doing back-to-back deals.
I don't think you mean 2005, 1995.
1995. So, 1985. 1985, my God, yes, wrong century, wrong decade, wrong everything. And I contacted the companies who had emboldened entries and basically started a wine business. And on the back of that, I started a restaurant business called Boisdales, which is focused on Scottish ingredients, where possible from the West Highlands. We're not from Scotland, but we also select a lot of British ingredients from all over.
I think it's the best of British, I would think. And
it's sort of the best of British with an emphasis on the West Coast of Scotland.
Yes. And then you've also got a jazz bar there. And
we started live music about 21 years ago. So we started with some classic jazz. I like the jazz of the 1930s most. And then we evolved into more bebop, and we took a bit of a soul route. So we're now one of London's, with a larger restaurant that we bought in 2010 called Boisdales Canary Wharf. We are now we probably employ more musicians than any other group of restaurants in London. We have four restaurants with live music every night, ranging from punk rock and roll to pop and blues and jazz and reggae.
You also then have got a magazine as well. You started on the back of it all.
I started a magazine about 6 years ago, which is great fun and punches above its weight.
That's a lot of work, though, because that's a monthly magazine, isn't it?
It's quarterly.
Quarterly, okay.
It's a lot of work, but it's not really that much work, because we pay our contributors, who are basically customers.
No, you didn't pay me.
Our real contributors is our day-to-day journalists, as in the professional journalists. And political writers and economists and people who make a living from writing.
So do I. I'm an author. Okay.
And, we pay those people in Boisdale pounds. And if we're promoting someone like yourself, which is a promotion of an existing business which benefits from it, then...
which I am now, but I wasn't then. But well done. Yes, I know, coming round to it. No, but it is. I enjoy it. There's quite a lot to read in it, and it's interesting, and it's fun contributors. So there's that, and I've always enjoyed the meals that George and I've had in Boisdale. We tend to go to the one in Belgravia, in Eccleston Street, which has been always good fun. And we've had the odd party there as well for friends, and it's delicious food and it's a fun atmosphere. And it's as we come to the end of an extraordinary year of a pandemic, it's that conversation, laughter, good food, swapping news, which I have sorely missed. Above all, to start with, you can cope just about, but as it goes on, I think it becomes ever harder. It really does. And I imagine you've furloughed some staff, but that nevertheless doesn't help necessarily supporting some of the business costs as you go on, Ranald. And I know on the back of that you've begun these rather amazing Zoom meal kits that you've begun through this last year, which I think have begun to really take off, haven't they?
I think we're the only people doing this, but I'm not certain of it. I've not found it elsewhere. But we've made our virtual events a little bit more interactive. So our first big virtual event, which we think will enter the Guinness Book of Records for the largest Burns supper ever curated. We had 1,064 people who consumed a quarter of a tonne of haggis between them across the length and breadth of the British Isles. And they all received whiskey, 4-course dinner, and a wonderful Rob Roy cocktail made with Ardbeg malt whiskey from Islay. And it was quite a show, because we started with a descendant of Robbie Burns giving the Selkirk grace. We then had Donald McLaren of McLaren from his ancient Highland home in Balquhidder piping in the haggis. Then we had James Cosmo, one of Scotland's best-loved actors of Braveheart, Highlander and Game of Thrones fame, then recite the ode to the haggis. We then had some great whisky experts talking to the audience. We then had one of Scotland's greatest young pop stars, Talia Storm, singing Auld Lang Syne, more bagpipes, me giving a boring speech. So it was an hour and a bit of curated entertainment, which you could listen to or not as you wished. And last night we did over 1,000 people for our Valentine's night. We did a soul show, and we had some major soul acts coming on performing live, and a lot of interaction. 600 odd households, most of whom selected to still be on video, dancing on the screens with spotlight different people. So it was just like a party with Veuve Clicquot Rosé. So that's all good fun. So making events more interactive, as we are planning and very excited about doing here at Highclere, when we will be having Highclere gin, which is a magnificent gin, listeners. It really is delicious. It has a nuance of lavender and a lot of spice complexity, as well as being very clean and refreshing and perfect as simply as a gin and tonic. It also makes wonderful cocktails and has a very good strength for a cocktail, particularly for a martini. But for our event here with you, Fiona, we're going to have delicious cocktails and then some time with you in the library, and you'll describe what's happened in this house with a few references to the other side of this house, which is obviously Downton Abbey.
Yes.
And then we'll have a wonderful, sumptuous dinner together. We'll be tasting stunning Californian wines, giving a nod to Geordie's American forebears. And then we have a master of wine, a famous British restaurant critic, William Sitwell, the writing family.
Author like me, writer.
Yes, yeah. Then we'll be tasting the delicious, herbaceous and wonderful Highclere cigar.
I know we've got two, the Edwardian and the Victorian. The Victorian's been really well received. So that's been quite an interesting development, which we did just before the gin to see if there was a market for Highclere Castle branded lifestyle effectively. And it has been a really interesting journey with our American colleagues. And the Highclere Castle gin now, I think it's become one of the most awarded gins in the entire world. It's had the most extraordinary reviews. It did take 4 years, Ranald, to create and make, and the bottle itself was quite a process to get the right colours so that when it was empty or full it still reflected the bluey purpley colour, and then it was the oats at the end which creamed the gin. We spent 9 months actually in this very room tasting gin. It was, but do you know, I learned so much from it. And Geordie went around all the different factories and gin bottling. We've been to and fro in America in the old days, and we did travel. Really proud of what we have done, and it's been very well received in America. And we've just got a distributor in Malta, and we're beginning to get into Canada and take small steps to keep going forwards. But thank you for your support, because I know there's a lot of gins in England, but I hope ours makes its own contribution and stands up for bottle and taste.
It does stand up. No, obviously, running 6 bars, I've looked at the gin market, and yours is both very distinctive in its style as well as reassuringly very fine English gin. So it works as it should work, but it also gives a little bit more. So I think it's one of the 2 or 3 most outstanding gins produced in Britain at the moment.
Oh, well, that's really, really kind. It's a great British export, so that's another reason I'm kind of quite proud of it in a really challenging time. So I think it's a good thing to put the flag behind, if you like. And I'm quite interested because we've done our virtual cocktail parties now, which we started in the very first lockdown last April, and with some hilarity and upside down in that we were holding the phones the wrong way up. They were all done off our mobile phones. And then luckily people thought their Facebooks were the wrong way around rather than the few people who bubbled with us here holding the phones the wrong way up. We've gone on from there to produce some good virtual cocktail parties and created, in fact, the largest virtual cocktail party in the world. And I know as we travel through the pandemic, as hopefully it begins to leave our lives, I'm sure there'll be calls to do a few virtual summer cocktail parties still to share when people are less able to travel, but combined with other days in which we can really welcome people to Louis' bar. And I have come to realise over the last few months what a talented mixologist Louis, our sommelier, our butler here is actually. And when I go to your bars now, I have a huge amount more respect for the mixologist behind your bar, Ranald.
Well, I always think of Jeeves in P.G. Woodhouse's rather wonderful books. He's always a good mixologist. He knew exactly what to make Bertie if he was hungover in the morning. Do you remember?
Do you know Jeeves in Worcester was filmed here with Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie at one point in the early 1990s, 1993?
I didn't know that. Yeah, I've got to know Hugh a little bit.
So, Ranald, I mean, obviously you went to Scotland, came back, set up your restaurants, and you and your wife, Kate, I think you've got 4 children now who are university beyond and going through the last stages of school.
They're sort of grown up, I suppose. Are you grown up at 21? They range from 21 to 28.
Wow. So they're all doing their own things and singing. Ranald was a great performer at university in terms of singing Elvis Presley, as far as I remember. Do any of your boys take after you, or girls take after you?
No, they're all musicians. Ranald has a band. He got to number 1 in Argentina, number 8 in Mexico, and he charted a couple of times here. He's had a few million downloads. Angus is a brilliant pianist. Jules thinks he's very good and has had him played.
Is Kate musical?
Kate was pretty musical, but she's just obviously got a mental block with it. She's sort of grade 8 on the piano, so she was very good, but she just doesn't play anymore.
Right.
But Angus taught himself by ear. He just, with his telephone on his ear, he learnt to play Fats Waller stride piano and plays really very, very well indeed. And Ranald's a good guitarist and pianist, and Hector's very good at the guitar. And they're all artists and musicians.
What fun.
It's sort of fun. It's scary, but fun.
Quite noisy when they're all at home, I'd imagine.
Oh, nice noise, though. I love it.
It's a good noise.
The piano. We've got 3 pianos in our house, and there's always one on the go.
How magical. And then you're back in Scotland for some of the time?
No, we sold our house in Scotland. My brother has a house in South Uist, which is where we're really from, and I'm looking to buy something up there. But ownership becomes less and less important as you grow older. Although it's still a big draw on me, because one wants to own things, but you don't really own anything for very long. So just spending time in Scotland is pretty good.
It is, and you can spend time with friends, and you can borrow someone else's house or rent a house, effectively,
yes.
Which is...
A house of a size where you can pack one's own family and a couple of other families in isn't that expensive to buy. Obviously, it's quite a lot of money, but it's not. It's really the running
costs,
costs of a house that can sleep 12, 14 people is just so phenomenal and far greater than the cost of actually the mortgage. You get a fixed rate mortgage now for 1.3%. So £1 million costs 13 grand a year to service. Whereas a £1 million house in Scotland might cost you 40 or 50 or more thousand a year to run. And then you think you'll make it back by renting it up. Because I did have quite a large house in Scotland. Did you ever come to it?
I went to your parents' house by Killin. That's what I remember.
Well, I bought another house about 8 miles from there called Mournish, and that had 14 bedrooms and a bit of land and a bit of lot frontage. So we had a lot. So I had 10 years of throwing big parties. It's
fun for your children.
Yeah, it's sort of out of my system now. Maybe we'll just get a little cottage or a caravan. Caravans are great, so you can move them wherever you want to go. My father had a caravan. He used to bring it up to...
I remember your parents' caravan to go to Ampleforth.
Yeah, God, it embarrassed me so much.
So you're going to be doing it now to your children?
I feel differently about it. I like the idea of a motorhome. It'd be quite good fun. You get a really luxurious motorhome. You just drive where you want to go.
Looking forward with the restaurants round, you've got obviously the original one, Eccleston Street. You've got the very large one at Canary Wharf. And then you've got one in Mayfair, I think, haven't you?
One in Mayfair and then one in Bishopsgate. The one in Bishopsgate is probably, I haven't quite said this in the public domain as yet, but I think it's the oldest restaurant in London.
Is it?
In as much as it hasn't been a restaurant for longer than any other restaurant, but the building itself is 17th century.
Right.
And so I can say it's the oldest building within which there is a restaurant in London, because very few buildings survived the Great Fire after the Black Death in 1666. And this was built after the Great Fire, but it was built in 1667.
Right.
So part of the restaurant was in the original vaulted cellar, which is rather atmospheric.
The hospitality and heritage business, both of which we're in, you've got an incredibly old restaurant, Bishopsgate, and we've got quite an old castle sitting behind us here, have been so challenged by this last year. The normal hustle and bustle, the money coming in and the employment it creates and the supply chains for the food and the drink have just been completely punctured. And I think it's been probably one of the worst business sectors affected by the pandemic. I don't know what you think about that. It's going to be a difficult way back, isn't it?
Well, definitely. Well, hospitality is the 4th largest employer in the country, employing some 3 and a bit million. So far in 2020, there were 650,000 redundancies and more to come. And we're in a particularly vulnerable position because obviously we manufacture on the premises and we also have sufficient space within our premises for all our customers to be. So we have the greatest exposure in terms of rent.
Yes.
And the greatest exposure in terms of number of people employed. And the British government, maybe in their wisdom, I don't know, because we'll see how this all pans out in 10 years' time, have provided far less support than the European governments and even the American governments.
Yes.
And I have a friend who has a restaurant in Paris and New York, and in both those restaurants, his costs of the pandemic were pretty much covered by the government within 8 or 9 weeks. In the UK, the only support we've had is furlough, which assists staff but doesn't assist a restaurant business with its other costs, which aren't very significant. And we had the Sybil loans, which were distributed via the British Bank to conventional banks and were only awarded on strict banking covenants and terms, which really meant that if you didn't have a business that was in a position to borrow, i.e. have 1.5 times cover within your accounts prior to COVID, 1.5 times the interest and the capital repayment, you couldn't borrow the money. And obviously businesses that didn't require to borrow money weren't necessarily in that position. They might be investing in expansion or whatever. So it meant that hundreds of thousands of businesses were denied the ability to get a Sybil loan and are pretty much standalone. So it is very difficult for hospitality. I think maybe the government just feels that they don't really mind about these businesses and they'll let them go under in the hope that, like burning the heather, that it'll grow back well. But it's not a very considerate way of approaching such a large part of the economy.
It's not a very good... The other thing is that given the amount of redundancies going on, the hospitality business often picked up those who had the least money, who offer them least part-time employment to help them and their families. So I know that when we can open, we can offer bits and pieces of part-time employment to those who perhaps most need it, whereas those people who are in the public sector, whose salaries and pensions are being paid anyway, are in a less needy position. So it has been an interesting approach, and like you, the furlough has been much appreciated, but at the end of the furlough the businesses may not be there, so it could be an extended redundancy.
Most businesses that I've talked to, from the board of directors down, there have been quite big salary cuts. There are 38,000 people in the public sector who earn over 100,000. I don't think there have been any redundancies or any salary cuts. If you're employed by the taxpayer, you're pretty well looked after. Obviously, a lot of the public sector is facing this pandemic and are valiant and wonderful people, but there are a lot of people in the public sector who are not, and arguably have had rather less to do than they would do normally. But there'll be no cuts made in that area. And another small point is that within the restaurant business, all our front of house staff are paid by a combination of salary and service charge. And service charge is very much a part of their salary. So they have a minimum wage, and then they might earn 2, 3, 4, 5, up to £10 an hour for senior management from the service charge, which is essentially 10% of our turnover, which is all distributed to staff. So the government hasn't recognised the service charge as salary, although it's very much what they live on, and it's somewhere between 20 and 40% of their salary. It hasn't recognised that as salary. So really, most people in this hospitality are getting 80% of minimum wage. So that's 3 million people really being done down by the government, which is, I don't like using the word unfair, but it doesn't seem correct when you consider how the public sector has been treated.
I think a lot is going to come out in the next 5 years, and I would just hope that looking forwards, if there were other challenging years such as we've had, and may they not be so deeply challenging, there can be a plan and a strategy which is then thought about in advance to be rolled out.
Well, what I've put forward to government as a commensurate to trade scheme is that the VAT is reduced on alcohol as well as food in restaurants from 20 to 5%. And that does proportionally give a kickback of funding back into hospitality. But currently, in their wisdom, the reduction of that was only on food. And 64% of all pubs in this country are wet-led.
Yes.
So if you're a wet-led business, booze-led business, pretty important for a community, for less affluent communities. It's the only way that people come out and socialise.
Yes.
And for an older part of that community who don't find a refuge in social media, this is their way of existing.
Well, beating heart is like on Coronation Street in EastEnders. The pub's the heart of the
they've
TV
had
programme.
zero support, not even on the VAT, which is... But VAT is quite a simple way of doing it, because there are no middlemen, no commissions, no bureaucracy. It's a straightforward cut, and it's proportionate to what you trade, so that it could repair balance sheets quite well in 12 months.
It could do, and I think it would be better if such a strategy were laid out for a year, for 12 months, rather than this short-term flip from one thing to another. And the uncertainty means that everybody falls over themselves to take advantage of something, rather than lays out a plan and strategy for somewhat longer.
But it must be puritanical zeal that made those in power think that wet-led businesses were not worthy of support. I can think of no reason for it. They selectively decided these businesses don't deserve support, and they're very important businesses. Everything can be abused, from a steering wheel to a knife. But no, these communities thrive on having the ability to meet in traditional pubs.
So, Ranald, when I met you at university, you were playing the guitar and singing Elvis Presley, and then you've gone into the drink and then the food business. But are those three equally weighted as drivers in your life, or is there any part of it which you prefer one to another?
Well, I managed to discover that Elvis, who I've always felt a great affinity for, is actually a distant relationship. So I do have a kinship with the king through his grandmother, Mary Macdonald. But beyond that, if you take a venue like Ronnie Scott's, which is probably one of the greatest jazz clubs in the world, if you took the music out of Ronnie Scott's, you wouldn't be left with a restaurant. With Boisdales, if you took the music out of Boisdales, you'd still have a restaurant. And we do now play vinyl vintage records in all our businesses, so we can have great music. So I suppose the food, the ambience, and if without live music we played just vinyl records, we'd still be very much Boisdales. But the music does drive me. It is very exciting.
And how do you see? Are you going to try to open one restaurant at a time as you can, or you're just going to take it step by step, Ranald?
Step by step. The balls are spinning less quickly than they were, so I can actually see them move. And we're beginning to make some sense of how to go forward. And
have any of them got some outside space? Presumably the one in Canary Wharf might
Canary Wharf has a 65-metre terrace. Belgravia, we have a cigar terrace, and we're building another terrace at the front, and we're expanding the pavement there. Bishopsgate has a small cigar terrace, and Mayfair has a small cigar terrace. And terraces are all the thing, although the British weather
makes it interesting.
Isn't the best. But,
I know we do takeaway food and takeaway picnics, which is always interesting until it rains. But I think we're eternally optimistic, which I think we have to be living in this extraordinary country. If you're looking ahead, what is your hope for the restaurants and how you're going to go forward in the next couple of years?
It's been quite an interesting period of contemplation and relaxation, albeit with the pressures of work. And I find myself working more hours than I did even in London, because there's less to distract you, and you can't justify a long lunch or endless entertaining dinners, so one's at home working harder. I'm pretty relaxed about it. I'll find a path through it all, and money isn't everything. And what I particularly found after the first lockdown last year was coming back on the floor in the restaurant for the first time in 22 years, working lunch and dinner 5 days a week. I really enjoyed the heart of what I do, which is try to make people happy and create a lovely experience. So I'm sort of quite happy with the idea of just working in my business, and quite how it unfolds, that manifests itself. I've got less desire to roll out dozens more restaurants. I did start Floridita as well with Terence Conran, and we rolled out a few of those. We opened in Moscow, Dublin and Madrid. I have been courted over the last few months by some restaurant groups in America looking at doing Vegas and stuff, but I'm not that interested in it, really. I just quite like doing what I'm doing, but I don't know exactly what that'll be. After the last lockdown, the first lockdown, they didn't allow any music to be performed for a month and a half, which is pretty crazy, because obviously a pianist not singing is not creating any issues of aerosol effect. But despite my best efforts, I wasn't able to get the public authorities to allow us to have music. So for us, the reopening is when they allow us to have music performed again. And obviously the festivals won't be going ahead early.
They won't be. I mean, we're going to have Mozart in the Gardens. I want to bring out some young musicians from the Royal College of Music in London to perform on the lawns outside, because there's enough space. If it rains, we can put up gazebos or something like that. And at the History Festival last year, which we did in October, that was quite fun, because we were allowed to have somebody performing outside in a gazebo again. So I had a wonderful young jazz singer, and again there was a space issue which we were able to overcome by being outside. But it was very important because they had no money. They also had no support from furlough. And for all the years of practice and all the pleasure they have given over lockdown and how they've tried to help, they had no financial help at all. So I was trying to think, I know that I've got to this Sunday in June with some Royal College of music students, and I was trying to think if I could have a regular programme, actually, Ranald, to support and pay and say thank you to some of the young musicians who need to get out there and be seen and to play and to have that interaction with an audience again.
Yeah, what works quite well is streaming. A lot of older musicians as well, and we employ several thousand musicians a year. Some of them have been doing quite well with streaming, even if they're not household names or even well known. They still have a little co-trip an audience who will give them a few £100 a week. But others have had to take jobs with Amazon and things like that.
Yes, well, you do what you have to do to get by, and you know that it's not going to be like this forever.
No.
But Ranald, let's end on an upbeat note. So what's your dream in the next year? What do you want to do most of all? Go on holiday?
No, I don't see any urgent requirement for a holiday. And I feel I've travelled enough. I'd just like to continue doing what I'm doing, and I don't really decide what I'm going to do till I wake up in the morning. But I normally get my teeth into something and then continue with it. Some of them are slightly self-serving things I enjoy doing, and some of the things I need to do, like bits of paperwork and things. That's not very conclusive, is it? And I'm also writing music. I've written 2 great songs I'm very happy with. The stage of the writing, I'm singing them, and I'm only writing on the guitar, but I'm transposing onto piano, and I'm very happy with these tunes. So I'm also writing various articles and short stories and working at our business. So I'm quite happy in a funny sort of way.
How fantastic. Ranald, thank you so much for coming today and for joining me. And I just wish you all the best, and I look forward to your restaurants being open and the music being played again and the sound of voices singing and laughter, and you'll be back on the floor.
Yeah, I'm sort of feel I ought to be offered something for my desert island at this point.
Hello, this is Lady Carnarvon, and just to say, please do subscribe to this podcast. Then you can be first on the list every time it comes out.